Welcome to GCSE AQA Sociology. This video is about what should I do if I get a question about culture or ethnicity. Now, first off, this is quite a controversial topic, so please allow me to explain that anything I'm saying is in a general sense or a stereotypical way is not meant to cause offence. So if I do, I apologise in advance. Let's first start with defining culture and ethnicity so we can discuss what we're talking about. So culture can be the arts and other manifestations of human intellectual achievement regarded collectively. Essentially, it's the stuff humans make, the stuff that we enjoy, as well as our ideas, customs and social behaviour of a particular people or society. And the example given is Afro-Caribbean society. Ethnicity is often confused with race, and this is where a lot of the issues come. Ethnicity isn't necessarily race, it's the fact or state of belonging to a social group that has a common national or cultural tradition. So it can be also the relationship between gender, ethnicity and class. That's something we link to, and that's something we're going to come back to. So while a lot of people understand ethnicity as race, it's more than that, it's more subtle than that, it's identity really, and you can interchange those terms quite nicely. And it's identity based on culture and based on background. So I hope that hasn't confused you too much. We'll go from here and see how we go. Research methods around culture and ethnicity. Really, these come down to what sociologists are trying to measure, because these are quite subjective. So culture can link to class, such as going to the opera versus going to the football. Or it can link to ethnicity, so something which links to a certain national identity or geographical identity perhaps. And this can bring into our sense of socialization, how we're socialized, in what culture, in what background we're socialized, can sort of dictate how we see ourselves and how others see us. And this has become a very contentious issue in modern times, and previously too. But you may think about sort of old research being white, middle class, upper class, intellectual, going to far-flung places where there's tribes people, for example, and studying those tribes people and trying to see what's a universal normal value, something that we'd see in our own society, and what makes them totally unique. And that's often seen in a very kind of colonial or patronizing way. Really, in terms of your GCSE, in a more modern sense, we're looking at social cohesion. If we're a functionalist, where is social cohesion? How does that link to culture and ethnicity? Are there different attitudes based on culture and ethnicity? So are there different attitudes in this country compared to other parts of the world? And Marxist could be class or wealth. And often where people get themselves into trouble maybe is making very broad stereotypical statements and linking it to perhaps immigration, and immigration being an agency of change in a society. So that may be something where a researcher perhaps could look at ethical considerations, for example. When it comes to data though, you may look at official statistics and qualitative data and ask yourself, well, how accurate can that be? If people are self-identifying as a particular ethnicity or from a particular background, does that tie in with what the government may consider? Because when we do a census every few years, sometimes more boxes have to be added in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of other areas or other demographics. Therefore, can we trust the data? And again, if it's qualitative data, how people see themselves, people may dispute or contest whether someone belongs to a particular group or particular culture or ethnicity, or they may be of mixed heritage and mixed race. Therefore, where do they fall? Are they half and half? Do they go in both boxes, or do they go in neither? So that's something that you may need to consider. So families, culture and ethnicity, this was probably the most controversial part of the course. What are different family types, or why are different family types more common in different parts of the world, is something that the textbook tried to focus on. And you may remember we looked at a map of the world and coloured in different parts and said, you know, traditionally or more commonly, there's nuclear families here and extended families there and lone parent families in other parts of the world. And then you might refer to this tweet here where AQA and the other textbook had some controversy in the national press about very broad statements, particularly around Afro-Caribbean families and single-parent families. And this offends people because there is more detailed and nuanced studies at A-level and degree level which perhaps would explain that better and perhaps wouldn't have such derogatory or negative connotations, if that makes sense. Because at GCSE level it maybe wasn't explained the best, or perhaps it caused problems for teachers, the books have been removed and re-edited, and new editions are coming. So there's controversy because it links to immigration, it links to social constructs, and it links to this idea of other. This idea that white British is not only the norm, but the measure for everyone else, and everyone else needs to measure themselves against that. So there isn't really a families question I could find which was specific about ethnicity, but if you look at this one, there's no longer a typical family in Britain. You may talk about family types and immigration and the changing diversity in Britain and link those elements together. Obviously, I'd caution you to be very sensitive when you do that and perhaps not focus your whole essay on it. But what you can see here is that ethnicity and culture and background can be linked to gender, can be linked to class, and will give you a very detailed and very sophisticated answer. And that's really where you should be aiming your efforts, not focusing on one particular thing, but using it as a sounding board or a way to reflect on other elements in society and other things you know about. And that will show the examiner that you have a really good grasp of knowledge and understanding. Education, culture and ethnicity again can be very controversial. So labelling and stereotyping may affect your education, because if teachers label and stereotype you, if your peers label and stereotype you, and you feel like you don't fit into your school, your class, you may struggle at school. And there's lots of anecdotal evidence about that. There's also positive and negative discrimination. If you look at the outcomes of education, there's obviously very broad stereotypes about different cultures, different ethnicities succeeding in schools in the UK and what that means. So, for example, if you look at the graph, white traveller, white gypsy and Roma children tend to have the lowest outcomes by a long way. Black Caribbean and mixed white and black Caribbean children not far behind, really. And this is something that the government talk about. White British are way down the list, about 2/3 of the way down. And obviously that could be because the population is so massive compared to the tiny minorities of traveller and gypsy children. Compare that to Chinese children, for example, who have a really high outcome, but how many Chinese children are actually in the UK education system? At 16 at least. When it gets to university, it's a different picture. And that's something else that you may see. The top universities are overwhelmingly white compared to the rest of the population. So what does that tell us about how people value their education? That's something that's really interesting. Therefore, if you have perhaps a language barrier, or you come from a different culture, it may be hard to understand some of the lessons, some of the subtleties. So your experience of school, not just in the classroom, but in terms of secondary socialisation, may make you struggle, may leave you behind. Or it may motivate you to work harder. There's lots of different arguments about this, but what you can do is you can look at this essay question and think about how you'd answer it. So would sociologists agree that your ethnicity is the main reason for differences? Well, certainly in terms of educational achievement, as we've looked at GCSE, there's massive differences based on ethnicity, and if you compare that to the rest of the population, it's a kind of the same thing as crime. The data doesn't stack up very neatly. The outcomes are not the same proportions as the population itself. So we need to explain that. And again, you want to look at your home factors, you may want to look at gender, you may want to look at things like parental attitudes, and bringing in studies that reflect that, such as Ball, such as the correspondence principle from Marxism. Those are all things that you want to talk about perhaps. And then linking it to gender, linking it to class, linking it to other things that can help. So this is an area where if you've got this question, don't panic. It may look difficult, but it's not, because really what it's asking you to do is focus on one area and then link it to the rest of the module. Crime, deviance, culture and identity. This is probably the most controversial of all topics because essentially of crime. And if you look at the background for this slide, I've selected a load of newspaper headlines, which is something that's been recently criticised by leading police officers. The media in this country and agenda setting, fueling this idea of racism perhaps and crime. Now, it's undeniable that in terms of percentage of population, black, Asian and mixed race people are massively overrepresented in prison and in the criminal justice system. And the same is true in America. Therefore, we have to ask ourselves why. Is it down to socialisation? Is it down to poverty? That would be one argument. Is it the fact that because immigrants tend to end up in the lowest class of society, the lowest stratas, are they more at risk of things like strain theory, more at risk of enemy? Or is a language or cultural barrier one of the reasons why people might not succeed, and then crime becomes the only means to success? If you look at the controversy around stop and search or around knife crime and how young male black offenders are pigeonholed in that way, whereas criminals who are white or don't fit into that aren't necessarily described as such. So how can being from another culture or ethnicity be seen as deviant? It may simply be that language, slang, dress, tastes, culture, art, that kind of thing can be seen as deviant. You don't fit in to what's gone before, therefore it's different, it's deviant. Why are offending rates higher amongst ethnic minorities than the rest of the population? That's something that's very controversial and very hotly debated. If you got this question, that racism is the main reason for differences in crime rates between ethnic groups, you could talk around comparisons between the chivalry thesis, so gender and ethnicity. You could talk around the fact of who's in the police. Police forces are often trying to recruit ethnic minorities to be more representative. So obviously there's a link to research methods there. On official statistics, there is a link to white collar crime in terms of, maybe for want of being clumsy here, white person crime? Is there more chance of being convicted if you are not of the white population, because police are more likely to pursue you, are more likely to be in an area where you live, for example? So there's a lot of things about labelling and stereotypes and institutional racism that you may want to explore, because the answer isn't simply yes or no in any of those cases. The answer is obviously a lot more sophisticated and complicated. What I would do here is I would acknowledge the fact that ethnic minorities are overrepresented in the courts, in the prison system, in the terms of convictions, and then link that to the rest of society, the rest of the processes and identities that we could talk about. So make the link between gender, the fact that men are far more likely to commit crime than women, link it to socialisation, link it to ethnicity, and think about what that could mean. That would be the best way to approach this essay. And then using studies, you could show how a lot of them perhaps are out of date because the population was different then, or the sociologists didn't focus on ethnic minorities particularly. If you look at Cohen's idea about youth delinquency, there's no mention of race, there's not even mention of class. The two modern rockers, the two caricatures, if you like, are totally arbitrary, they're totally subjective. They're not really anything more than a label that's been made up entirely at that time to something very specific. So here with this question, you really want to show off your knowledge. And again, you can make links to family, to education, to social stratification. That's fine, but don't go too far down one route. You need to focus it on crime. But I actually feel if you got a question like this, it would be very good. If this came up in your exam, it would be one that a lot of students could do very well on because of that. Social stratification, culture and ethnicity. This is really looking at class and population changes. So how has the British population changed? Well, we probably think of it as a very 20th century idea, the Windrush generation, World War II, the breakdown of the empire, all of those kind of things, bringing in populations from around the world. But how far do you want to go back with Britain? The Romans, the Normans, the Vikings, the Saxons, etc., etc. There's been so much cross-cultural pollination, if you like, and changes over time. Britain is an island culture, it's an island physically. Therefore, the population has changed massively throughout any given period, I would argue. So that's something that's often overlooked, perhaps. If you look at inequalities based on ethnicity and culture, well, the poorest people in our society are Pakistani and Black African, if you look at the graph at the bottom, by a long way, by a huge factor. Now, is that because of where they come from in the world? You know, why are they coming to Britain? Is it education in that part of the world compared to here? Is it wealth in that part of the world compared to here? Is it a mix of factors? And is it first, second, third generation? You know, the stats there are not very clear. But what it does show is there is an issue around poverty and ethnicity and background. If you look at the changes in population, Britain has grown by 7.8%, but in some ethnicities it's more than 100%. You know, Black African, there's been a huge influx of Black African immigration since 2001. There's been a big increase in mixed heritage in population. There's been a big increase in Pakistani and Bangladeshi immigration. And all other ethnicities only make up 3% of the population, but have massively increased. And the projection that 20 to 30% of the population will be non-white by 2051 is an interesting prediction to make. Therefore, we can always look at this in terms of a curve on a graph and an increase. So if you've got a question around ethnicity and culture, it's very hard to find one in the social stratification section because it's a new section. Really, you link it to social class as the main cause of inequality, and you talk about how social class is, you know, very much divided in many different ways. And in terms of the upper and middle classes, is almost exclusively white. And if you think back to family, if you think back to education, think back to crime, middle class and above, you know, teachers a middle class profession. The criminal justice system is full of white middle class people as well and beyond. So what does that tell us? So we can make very race-based stereotypes, and that's very difficult. But think about the ideas of culture and background fitting into British culture. You know, if we focus solely on immigration, how do people assimilate? How do they feel British, become British? What do they bring to the country? That's something that's very hotly debated, and that changes over time. You know, if you're second, third, fourth generation, how socialised, how much do you fit in is something that sociologists will be really fascinated by. So that can then link to social mobility. If your grandparents came to a country very poor, by the time it's got to you and your generation, how far up the social ladder have you climbed? Have you moved anywhere, if at all? That's something that you may want to look at and think about. So social class is the main cause of inequality. That can be linked to gender, that can be linked to ethnicity, to education, to all of the other things. So it's a very broad question. And when you bring in culture and ethnicity, it's about access, it's about understanding. So judgment, labelling, stereotype, stigma, all of those things again come into all of these questions. I hope this video has been useful. I hope it's been insightful. Again, don't have the scope to cover everything, and trying to be very careful to be as informative and useful as I can. If I've missed anything, if you have any questions, please comment. Please leave me questions on the Google Classroom. Please come and see me. Thank you again for listening.